Even the most unobservant person can't fail to have noticed the return of vinyl records from the wilderness. In recent years, the market for these has exploded. So the question today is the same thing going to happen to reel-to-reel? Now, the only reason I'm addressing this is because in 2015, the Verge website published an article entitled "Reel-to-Reel Tape is the New Vinyl." So the question is it? And what exactly did they mean by that? Well, it's quite a complicated answer, as you'd expect. For a start off, you're not going to be able to go into a shop anytime soon and buy a new pre-recorded reel-to-reel tape over the counter. However, reel-to-reel tape is enjoying a bit of its own mini resurgence amongst the very high-end hi-fi community. It's not on machines like this. In fact, the tapes that they're producing won't even play on this machine. So first off, I'm going to have to explain exactly why that is and the different kinds of reel-to-reel tapes and formats that came out over the years. So I best start off by just talking about the machine that I've got here. This is the Pioneer RT909, a very popular open reel recorder from the very tail end of the home consumer reel-to-reel market. Now, despite being made by the Japanese company Pioneer, it wasn't sold in Japan. They were all for export only, a lot of them making their way over to Germany, where there was still a big market for these open reel recorders, and that's where I bought this one from. It was sold there from 1979 up till 1984, at which point Pioneer discontinued their reel-to-reel range. But those last few years for reel-to-reel really were its golden era. The machines that came out during that time were some of the best models ever made. These machines were positioned as the ultimate home recorder for the enthusiast and were often able to record onto the larger 10.5-inch diameter reels of tape. Compared to the more traditional home format of 7-inch reels, of course, the 10.5-inch reel size meant you could either record for longer or record for the same amount of time, but at a higher speed, which would give you better quality. Now, of course, these machines will play back those 7-inch reels and record onto them as well, but it wasn't as important as it had been, because at this point in the 1970s, not many people were buying the pre-recorded albums that came on those 7-inch reels anymore. Now, before I bought my Pioneer, I was using this Akai GX625, and in many ways I prefer the way this machine looks over the Pioneer with its analog VU meters and its light-up buttons. But there was a reason why I changed machines. It was because this one only plays in one direction. Now, to demonstrate why that was a hassle, I'll show you with this machine, even though it does play in both directions. So pretend it doesn't for the moment. So what would happen is, once you've played side A of your tape, the tape comes off like this. You then have to get the spool with the tape on, move it onto the other reel, flip the empty reel over, spool the tape back onto the empty reel again, and press play to play the other side of the album, which is usually somewhere in about 20 odd minutes or so. Now, the way that RT909 and other two-way play decks work is, once you get to the end of side A, you hear it fade out, quickly get up from your chair, before it unspools, press stop and then press play to play it back in the other direction. But this one goes a little bit further than that because it's got auto reverse, so no need to jump up from your chair. All you need to do is, at the end of side A, add a piece of this adhesive foil. That will activate a sensor inside the machine, which will make the tape run back in the other direction. So you'll see it go through here, activate the sensor, it pauses for a second and then starts playing the tape back on side B, and of course spooling it back onto the original reel again. Now, as a format, open reel or reel-to-reel tape is quite unusual, because despite the fact the home machines use the same 1/4-inch wide tape throughout, the quality over the years declined. The 1980s releases, the ones right at the end of the format, will sound worse than those from the 1960s, and it's more than likely that those ones will sound worse than the ones from the 1950s. And to explain why, we'll have to go back to the beginning, then work our way forwards. Right, so if we start with the simplest version, we've got a mono tape here. We've got a single tape head underneath it, the tape's moving from left to right, and the audio is being recorded across the whole width of the tape. But that means using quite a lot of tape up, and tape was expensive. So to use half the amount, or be able to record twice as much on the same amount, what you do is you put a half width head in there. So now you're recording on one half of the tape, you get to the end, you flip it over, you record on the other half. So you're getting twice as much on the tape. However, your recording quality is being reduced as well because you're now only using half that width. But if you want to create a stereo version, what you do is you use the same head that you were using for that system. You have one way up, one the other way up, and you've now got yourself stereo. The only problem is those heads are next to each other, so the audio is reaching each head at a different time, so there's a slight delay between them. These are known as staggered heads, and this was the first stereo tape system for the home. And staggered head tapes had to delay the audio between the left and right channels so that they sounded right when they went across the heads. But shortly afterwards they developed a 2-track tape head, which meant you could now have the audio in sync. But what it also meant was that this system was incompatible with the other one. These are known as inline heads. So for a while, tapes had to specify on the front whether they were for inline stereo or staggered stereo. So you think this is the ideal. We've got a nice simple 2-track stereo system. It sounds excellent as well. The only problem is that it's expensive because it's using twice the amount of tape as a mono album would do. So within a very short period of time, they introduced 4-track, which is the format that my machine plays, but by introducing this we can now play the tape in either direction, use half the amount of tape that we were using for the 2-track system, but again, of course, you'll have noticed we've reduced the width of the tracks. This isn't going to sound as good as the previous system, but it's all about cost because reel-to-reel tapes were very expensive, and all the time they were out, they were always competing with the much cheaper vinyl records. But before I get to that, for completion's sake, I just want to mention that the playhead in my machine, which has 2-way play, would look like this. We've got 4 individual heads. 2 would be activated when the tape moves in one direction and then 2 when it moves back in the other. Of course, once you've got a tape head like that with 4 individual channels on it, you can have quad, and indeed there were some quad tapes and quad machines to play on them for a brief period of time, and those used the 4 individual channels at the same time for front left and right and rear left and right. But we'll move away from that. We'll go back to 1956. Now, this is just 2 years after the launch of the first home stereo reel-to-reel machines in the US, but of course those were really for very early adopters with very deep pockets, some of whom will have got burned by getting the staggered tape head stereo systems because now we've moved on to the stacked or inline ones. But things are starting to settle down, get a bit more momentum now. There's a few more companies coming into the market and people are starting to buy stereo reel-to-reel for the home, and this is the first chance that many people got to listen to stereo systems within their own house. Now, it took the major record labels a little while longer to embrace the format, but this is from Capitol. This is their very first stereo tape, 2-channel, 7.5 inches per second for inline heads. This is the introduction to stereo, a demo tape really. It's ZA1, it's the very first one from 1957, and as is common with a lot of these stereo demo tapes, it contains various sound effects as well as short snippets of some other recordings. You can see the various recordings are on either side of this label here, although the tape is all on one side because of course it's a 2-channel tape, so it just runs from left to right, and it's only quite short as well because it's run at 7.5 inches per second. But I can't play it on my reel-to-reel machine because that's a 4-track tape machine, so I've had to get myself a new machine so I could demonstrate this to you. But not just for this though, I'll show you something else in a moment, but I've got a Revox B77 Mark II. Now, the Revox B77 and the Mark II were a range of really quite high-end semi-pro machines. As you can see here, this one costs $1,799, around about 1980-81, whereas my Pioneer cost $895 in 1979, so quite a bit more expensive. And the B77 Mark II was available in a lot of different specifications. You could have 4-track, you could have 2-track at different speeds. I've got a 2-track machine here, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to play you some samples from this tape, just a short amount, but I want to mention to you beforehand that there's a massive dynamic range on here. It goes from very quiet to very loud, so if you've got headphones on, I've warned you. Now, let's just have a listen for a minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's 1 minute to midnight on New Year's Eve in Times Square. Listen to the roar of that crowd. But listen to it now in stereo. The sound of New Year's Eve in stereo. The vivid sound of reality itself. The next example of stereo in action takes us to the neighborhood bowling alley.
Okay, fellas, set 'em up, please. Look out, everybody. Here we go. Well, looks like I can handle those tricky gutter shots all right. Next time I'm gonna aim for the pins.
There's no doubt about it. Stereo is the sound of reality. Whether it's the sound of a strike being scored or a huge diesel locomotive getting ready to move out of the yards.
Well, that should have woken a few people up. You don't hear dynamic range like that anymore. And I've got to reiterate that that tape is 60 years old. It's from 1957 and it still sounds as good as that. So why didn't reel-to-reel take over the home? Well, your answer is because the next year, 1958, they introduced stereo records. And stereo records were considerably cheaper than stereo reel-to-reel recordings, which is why they kept trying to make them cheaper by splitting the tape in half, making it from 2 to 4 track. In this report from 1959, they mentioned that the stereo phonograph record player sales for 1958 accounted for 25% of the US market, but stereo records themselves only accounted for 5% of retail sales. So it's still very early days for the stereo record. Now, at this point, things look a little bit rosier for reel-to-reel tapes. 70% of tape recorders produced during 1958 were stereo models. However, it's really just a drop in the ocean. There were only 1.9 million tape recorders in people's homes at the end of 1958, as opposed to 29,900,000 record players. And whilst they'd sold 410,000 tape recorders in 1958, they'd sold 4.1 million record players. So really, once stereo record players had started to take hold, reel-to-reel just could not keep up, and people tended to use their tape recorders for recording rather than playing back pre-recorded albums. One incentive, though, for people to continue buying their pre-recorded albums on reel-to-reel tapes was that when they sound good, they sound really good. The only problem is that those good sounding tapes got fewer and fewer as time went on. Not only had we gone from 2-track to 4-track, but by the time the 80s rolled around, this had happened. So what's happened here is, to further reduce the cost of producing reel-to-reel tapes, they've tried to get rid of as much tape as possible. If I go back to this album here from the 1970s, just look how much tape's in there, and then compare that to this one, which admittedly is from the very tail end of the releases. You usually had to send off for tapes in the 80s, but you can see it's using half the amount. Now, it's quite hard to see on that reel, so if I get another clear reel, this one is from the 1960s, you can see twice the amount of tape on the one on the left as on the right. And the reason is because Lionel Richie, despite the fact he says he can't slow down, he has done. He's running at 3 3/4 inches per second, which is half the speed of this tape here, which is running at 7.5 inches per second. And despite what the adverts might say, if you slow a tape speed in half, you're going to notice a significant reduction in sound quality and an increase in background hiss. So those first tapes that came out in the 1950s, those were running at 7.5 inches per second. Getting to the 1960s, we moved across to 4-track tapes, and you're going to see a variety of 7.5 and 3 3/4. Getting to the 1970s, your 7.5 tapes are getting rarer, and by the time you get towards the end of the 70s and into the 80s, you're only really going to see 3 3/4 inch per second tapes for sale. And nowadays it's those higher speed tapes, the 7.5 inch per second version, which are the ones favoured by collectors. Quite often they will pay a significant premium for them. They'll pay double the price for double the speed. But 4-track open reel tape really is now just a collector's market. The last releases that came out on the format were only available mail order in the US from Columbia House, and they were discontinued in the mid-1980s. However, that's not the end of the story, because in recent years a number of companies have started offering new pre-recorded open reel tapes again. But these are nothing like my 4-track tapes from the 60s and 70s. They're even better than the 2-track tapes from the 1950s. They're more like studio masters, because these tapes are running at 15 inches per second, so an album is spread across two 10.5-inch reels. Arguably the most famous name behind these tapes is an organisation that calls itself the Tape Project, and it's advisable, if you want to know more about these, to go onto their website, because there's a wealth of knowledge on there about the tapes themselves, but also the machines that they recommend you play them back on. Now, ideally you'd use a professional machine out of a recording studio, but if you must, you can slum it with a prosumer machine, but they recommend replacing a lot of the mechanical components, just using the machine to drive the reels and taking the audio itself off the tape head and putting it into a separate preamp. You can spend a lot of money on this. But if you prefer to go for a more ready-made solution, head over to United Home Audio and they will sell you one of their heavily modified Tascam machines. Now, these things apparently win all sorts of awards every time they show up at a high-end hi-fi show. But then again, perhaps they should do, because the more expensive of the range is $22,000 and the cheapest one they sell is $6,500. But notice there, they've sold out for 2017. There's actually a waiting list for these. But once you've got your machine, you'll want something to play on it, so why not get the album Willie and the Poor Boys from Creedence Clearwater Revival, yours for just $450 US, and that price isn't out there. It's kind of average for one of these sets. These are in euros, and as you can see, the 2 reel sets are up to €445. Now, you might be asking, why do they cost so much? Well, to buy 2 blank tapes isn't cheap, as you can see here, but then after that, the whole process of recording them is very time-consuming, and they're going back to the original master tapes in many cases as well. Let me explain how it works. Well, a recording studio in the 1960s or 70s, once they finished making an album, would run off a number of production master tapes. Now, there'd only be a small number of these, but these companies selling these reels claim to have got hold of one of these master tapes and then are running one-to-one duplicate copies of them at real time, and those are the tapes that they're selling on to you. Now, one of the companies says that they run off 8 at a time, but even at that number, you can only run off a certain number before you start wearing out that master tape. Now, some of these websites are a little bit vague. It's possible that they're creating another tape in the middle. They're making 8 of the black one, and then from that they're running another 8 off each time they make a duplicate, therefore not going back to that original master and wearing it out. But I asked them this question and they haven't got back to me. However, another way of doing it is just to make a digital copy of the original master tape, and then you can run off as many as you want without wearing out that original tape. Now, digital is almost a swear word in these circles, so I've noticed a number of these websites trying to avoid it, but I've got a feeling Analogy Records is using a digital master. They say they create an original master directly from their multi-track recording system. That sounds like a digital system to me nowadays. Now, I'm not against the idea of using a digital master, far from it. It makes more sense to me than making a copy off a copy off a copy or wearing out a master tape. Once you get that master tape duplicated, you can then make perfect copies. In fact, in a recent issue of What Hi-Fi magazine, there was an article about remastering the Brian Eno albums, and for that they captured the original master tapes in high-res digital at 192 kHz 24-bit and then did some repairs on them to remove sibilant S's and some clicks that have been created by a damaged tape machine, before then using that digital master to create other versions of the album. But regardless of how these 15-inch per second tapes have been mastered, it's time for me to now try playing one. Now, I mentioned earlier on there was another reason why I bought this particular machine, and the reason is because this one does a speed of 15 inches per second. Someone has spec'd it up, presumably for studio work. Now, when I bought this, someone had replaced all the capacitors in it as well, so it's as good as it's going to get, really. On the back here, you'll notice there's a sticker that says 2-track CCIR. CCIR is the equalization. Now, tapes like this used NAB equalization, whereas when you get above 15 inches per second, it's advisable to use CCIR, which is also known as IEC. Now, because NAB is a much more common standard, on the Tape Project's website they explain why they're using IEC equalization. It goes into quite a bit of detail there, but suffice it to say you need a machine with the right equalization to match the tapes, or at least buy the tape that can match the equalization on your machine. So fortunately mine does CCIR. So when I went to choose a tape, I chose the option to have CCIR equalization. Now, for rather obvious reasons, rather than buying a full $450 dual tape album from the Tape Project, instead I went over to Analogy Records and got hold of their 15-inch per second sampler tape for a mere €115. So this sampler tape contains a number of different artists. These are artists that are released on Analogy Records' own label. They do the recording of them as well, and they've combined them all together here on one reel, just to give a feeling for how good these tapes really are. Now, this is a tails out tape. That means that the tape has to be rewound before it can be played. So you put it on the right-hand reel on your machine and wind it onto the left one so that you play it, and by the time you're finished, it ends up back on the original reel again. Now, I'll play you a tiny snippet of this tape, although it's all a bit academic really, because of course you're listening to a stream digital file, and the whole idea of this thing is that it's the best analog source possible. However, I'm going to play you a little bit out of the first 2 tracks that you see on this card.
All around the mesmerizing, shining symphony of colors innocently descending upon me.
So there you go, that's proved absolutely nothing really, but from my end I've got to say it sounds excellent. Of course, I tried it with my best headphones, which I think was the best way to hear it, and it really does sound outstanding. Now, if you wanted to buy yourself a new reel-to-reel machine, well, nobody makes new ones. The company that I mentioned earlier on are actually refurbishing Tascam machines that stopped being manufactured back in 2004. Of course, they're doing a complete overhaul. It's not just a start-up job, but still, nobody's making new reel-to-reel machines. A couple of years ago, though, there was talk of Revox coming back with a new tape machine just for these 15-inch per second tapes as a playback-only device, and they were going to do that in conjunction with Horch House, which is one of the companies that offers the tapes for sale. Now, it was rumoured to cost a fortune, in the tens of thousands of dollars, but it was supposed to be out in the first quarter of 2017, and it's now the end of 2017, and there's been no mention of it for quite a while. The design concept images showed a very nice looking machine, which was only a playback device, but there's no mention of this anymore on the Revox site or on Horch House. However, I noticed this name on the design images, so I went on his website and there's no mention of it there either. So something's happened. I think the whole thing's been canned, but it would have been nice to have a new machine out, even if obviously I couldn't afford it. In fact, if you go on the Revox site, they did start selling reel-to-reel tapes again back in 2015, but if you go on the store now, it's not currently available. However, you can still get hold of tapes, which I think would be the ones they'd sell, from Horch House themselves. Now, just before we move away from this section, I have a feeling that I haven't got into enough detail about how good this tape sounds. So in my opinion, which is the only one I've got, it sounds as good as anything that I have ever heard. If you ever get a chance to hear one of these 15-inch per second tapes, jump at it, because you'll be very impressed with it. But of course, that then leaves just the one question. So the big question is, am I going to replace this machine with my 2-track 15-inch per second reel-to-reel so I can listen to these very expensive tapes? And the answer is no, one's enough for me. It's just something I wanted to try. It's a little bit like one of those track days, red letter day type things where you just try something out and then you go, yeah, that was good, and then come back home again afterwards. I mean, yeah, it's brilliant. They sound excellent, these. I think a lot of that, though, is down to the recordings and the mastering and things. Of course, you can have a terrible sounding reel-to-reel tape and a good one, same way as you can with a record. And with these, of course, they've done everything they can to make them sound good. And I think the kind of music that they're playing on these lends itself to the format as well. You know, that kind of acoustic type stuff. I reckon if you got a current pop record, for example, and put that on one of these, it wouldn't sound any different than it does on an MP3 player. So yeah, interesting to try out, but really if I was going down this route, it's getting an expensive new machine rather than that old thing that I've got there. Buying £450 tapes every now and then. There's a very limited catalogue, of course, upgrading everything, the speakers and the amplifier and goodness knows what else. And then on top of that, how good is my hearing really? Would I be able to tell a difference? So yeah, an interesting thing to try out. If you're interested in learning more about any of the things in this video, there'll be links in the video description. Right, there's just one extra thing I want to mention before I go, and it's about subscribing to YouTube channels. And I'm not necessarily talking about my own here. This is just something that cropped up in the last week. I noticed I hadn't subscribed to a couple of channels that I've been watching now for years. And the reason I hadn't is because I'm automatically recommended the next video that that channel produces because I've watched their previous one. So it's quite easy to miss out on clicking that subscribe button. In fact, one of those channels was the 8-Bit Guy, who you might be aware that we collaborated on a video in the past, and I'm a patron of his channel, and yet I hadn't subscribed to it. Of course, I've corrected that now on the channels I'd missed out on. So all I'm saying is just have a look through your own YouTube, and if there's a channel that you haven't subscribed to that you enjoy, just click that subscribe button because it does help them out. But that's it for the moment. As always, thanks for watching.